So I'm going to actually have, so we have the representatives from three different angles. We have Kristen Mattel, who's, there you are, Kristen, who does consulting for industry in these areas. We have Renee. Renee is the former CEO of Cala Health. Everyone's probably aware of Cala Health, and has really paved the way for wearables. And now she does board work and investor, and she'll mention some other things she's doing. But to hear your story and what you've learned about reimbursement and regulatory and why you'll never do it again would be absolutely a wonderful tale. And finally, we have Lindsay Jardin. She is from Adraxe, and we'll hear. What's that? Did I get it?
Yeah.
All right. And we'll hear what you have to say as it relates to a reimbursement and also regulatory, and how it is different today in today's environment. And Jim referenced in terms of some very concerning information on certainly on the pain side with ablation and other forms in 24 states as a proposal for CMS. And, will that trickle over into neuromodulation, particularly PNS? So that's, concerning for the industry. So any insights you have in terms of today's environment, and maybe you can weave that into your stories. But let's actually start with Renee, if that's okay, to hear your story about Cala Health and anything else you want to share. But the story as it relates to really reimbursement and regulatory, what you learned, what advice you would have, and how would it be different today in today's environment? No, but you got 7 minutes. Or do you want to do it here?
No, let's do it. Is this on? No. There we go. Okay. I'm going to keep this short and tight, so please ask questions. A little bit of background. I've done things in the neuromodulation field my entire career. I started out in investment banking. I went to J&J as an investor. J&J had a very significant, several $100 million across many neuromodulation companies. And in that journey, I joined the board of NeuroPace, which we ended up taking public in 2021. So neuromodulation is deep into the core of who I am, and I love this space. So I will do it again. So mark my words. Quick on Cala. Cala was a company that I met the founder, Kate Rosenbluth, at Stanford. And what she was doing hearkened to me to be the same thing we were doing at NeuroPace. It was a closed loop neuromodulation system, but we were doing it through a wearable form factor. And that kind of blew my mind. And so I said, Kate, we're going to start a company. And she told me all the reasons why. I just had a baby. I just did. We couldn't. And 6 weeks later, Cala was born. So I won. I was on the board since day one. We actually got started with our clinical journey before the breakthrough designation came out. And so we would have been a breakthrough designation product. We were de novo 510K. We actually did 2 studies to get our approval. One was about a 35 patient study, and one was about an 80 patient study. They were single center randomized controlled studies. Headline, we missed our endpoint of our larger study, but we luckily made the secondary endpoints. And we got approval to commercialize the product from the FDA through a de novo in 2018. So April of 2018, here we had this beautiful approval from the FDA, but we didn't have any long-term data. And for a wearable, you kind of need to know this is going to be used more than just once. And so we ended up choosing to go for a very large single-arm study, but it was over a 3-month course of care. And in that study, we were able to really begin to develop our marketing claims. So in that early study, we showed about 54% of patients got an improvement in their tremor. Cala is neuromodulation for essential tremor, is what we started with. And on the heels of that, I stepped in as CEO in September of 19, and we started commercializing. The first thing we did was submit to CMS for an approval. Once we had kind of 3 months of on-market data, which is kind of what you needed to show that the people would be buying the device, it was a cash pay device at the time, we filed for coding from CMS. 1 year later, we received 2 unique codes. We have a durable medical equipment category. We have a device that's used in the home with 2 components: the neuromodulation stim, puck is what we called it, and the band, which housed our proprietary electrodes. About a year and a half later, after all sorts of lumps and bumps, and appeals, we ended up with wonderful pricing for our stimulator. But they said, you know what, just use TENS pricing for your bands, even though our TENS, our bands were like several $100s and not a couple bucks like TENS. And then 3 months later, we actually came through with nice pricing for our device. So here we're sitting, great coding, unique coding to CALA. We have great pricing. I think the stimulator puck was around, Allie's in the room, but around $4,000 of reimbursement. And ultimately the bands were reimbursed at about a $500 level. So you can imagine, I had a sales force that was hungry to go, 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 and go they did, and they went too hard and too fast. So by May of 2023, so we launched in 2019, this multi-year process. In May of 23, the MAC contractors acted independently outside of the CMS process and issued a proposal that said the coverage, that the technology was not medically necessary, and so therefore they would not grant coverage. That proposal actually opened up a hearing process. And this is now my, 18th time in front of CMS and the MAC contractors. I led a process to overturn that decision. And we did so with publications. We basically got 3 publications published that showed that in the most severe patients across multiple years of commercial use, we had patients using the device out 3 years. They were still using it 3 or 4 times a week and still getting the increasing tremor benefit from it. So remember that 54% mark? We now published data that showed it was like 60 or 65% benefit of tremor reduction. So no habituation, patients loved it, they were using it, and it had a great benefit to the Medicare population. So in February of the following year, they actually, in 2024, they overturned their decision. Company has since gone on to raise funding, and they're back selling into the Medicare population. In the meantime, though, Ali Samian, who is my head of reimbursement, he and I were part of a massive layoff. I laid myself off because we had no idea how long the appeal process would take for them to overturn to a positive decision. We knew we were going to get it because our data was phenomenal, but we just had to exit about half the company. And so I exited in September of 2023, and now I'm running a drug delivery company, so totally out of the neurospace.
Great, thank you.
Is that what you wanted?
That's great. Well,
Okay.
some questions in a moment, but no, thank you for sharing that story. But it does bring up a lot of questions, and but we'll get to that in a moment. So, Kristen, why don't you go next in terms of mention a little bit about your background, your consulting work, and how you can help the many companies out there.
Briefly, or do you want me to use slides?
Do we have the slides?
Yeah, so I'm Kristen Mittal, co-founder and CEO of Mittal Consulting. And so we do regulatory affairs consulting for medical device startups. Next slide. So before I get into our services, let me tell you a little bit about our background and how we came to be. So I worked in the industry for over a decade at small, medium, and large medical device manufacturers, large like Stryker and Johnson & Johnson, medium size like Biotronic and LivaNova, probably many of you know, and a handful of startups. When I worked at all of these different companies, I saw that the large companies usually had more than enough time and resources to throw at pretty much any regulatory problem until it fixed, but the startups didn't. Generally, they got 1, if they were lucky, 2 chances to get the regulatory strategy right. And if not, we saw many of them go out of business. As a lot of the innovation comes from these small medical device manufacturers and startups, that was quite tragic in my opinion, and I thought this was an unmet market need. So 5 years ago, we created the company specifically to address this niche of getting high quality regulatory affairs consultants for devices looking to change the current standard of care, and at a size and a nimble, efficient team that works for them. So ideally, we like to start very early on with our clients at regulatory and reimbursement strategy. So right as they're spinning out of university or incubator programs, and then work with them from the long term to eventually implement this strategy through Q submissions, IDEs, PMAs, all of the required steps in the journey to get through the FDA. And then continue to support them on the post-market side. So if they want to go to the market with an initial weak indication, like a tool state indication, and subsequently upclassify, if that's part of the strategy, we continue on with them through that. On the flip side of it, we also do VC due diligence for these companies VC companies portfolios who are looking to bring on these medical device startups into their portfolio. So we're able to see both sides. We know what the VCs are looking for to help these startups better position themselves to get the funding they need as well. Next slide. So these are really our bread and butter in terms of the types of submissions we do. We do tons of pre-submissions because most of our clients are very novel, very complex. So we have a lot of different scientific issues we need to work through with the FDA and get consensus on and have the FDA come around to how we're thinking about certain issues. The one I specifically want to highlight here is breakthrough submissions because we do tons of these. I would say at least 2/3 of our clients we've either already gotten breakthrough for or we're in the process of getting it. And it goes hand in hand with the fact that we're doing novel, complex types of devices. And this can be really useful for not just their regulatory journey, but also their overall commercialization journey. Because if they're in certain categories, then we can continue to get them TAP. And we've had really good experiences with TAP as well. Next slide. All right. On that note, we wanted to be a purely regulatory consultancy firm, but after working with all of our startups, we realized that we needed to offer reimbursement strategy as well, because we kept asking them at the very beginning, as we're doing their regulatory strategy, to go out and get a reimbursement strategy assessment so that we could use that as an input as we were designing our regulatory strategy. And that was surprisingly more difficult for them than I thought it would be. So eventually over time, we've lumped that into our services as well because it's so important. We don't want to choose the easiest regulatory strategy for our clients anymore. That might have been okay back, a decade ago, but today we really need to have an integrated regulatory strategy where commercialization and reimbursement endpoints define the regulatory strategy, and we creatively figure out what that looks like so that in the long term they can be commercially successful, as opposed to just getting them through the FDA and then asking, okay, what's now? What's the next 5 to 7 years of figuring out this reimbursement thing look like? All right, next slide. All right. How we normally start engaging with companies is through a regulatory strategy report. I think this might be different than many that you are used to. These are very comprehensive, usually 50 to 70 pages that we do. And the whole point of this is, as the company is early on, they have potentially a lot of different indications they could go down. They could make small design changes to their device to slightly modify how it operates, and this potentially can have significant impact on the regulatory strategy. So we want to make sure they understand what all of their options are and all the pathways that they have available to them. And then from that, work with their commercialization and reimbursement teams to define, of all of these potential pathways, what's the best pathway for this company at this time for us to choose to go down. So we do this both before funding, that they actually use this to help strengthen their pitch decks to be able to get funding. And then after funding, once they're ready to say, okay, what's next? What does our FDA journey look like? Next slide. All right. Why us? Well, we're the only medical regulatory affairs consultancy that is exclusively designed for startups. So we understand the startup journey. We understand the different considerations and the different risk profile tolerances that are very different than a large company. Startups have to go a lot quicker. They have to move a lot quicker. And they have to be a lot more flexible, nimble, and agile to be able to successfully get to the market. So likewise, we position ourselves that way. One of the way we do that is we have a wide variety of consultants. So we have in-house regulatory affairs specialists who are phenomenal writers. They do the writing, and they take advice from our ex-FDA consultants who represent pretty much every branch at the FDA, including neurology. And we have it in this model because we don't actually want the ex-FDA consultants writing the submissions. They're really good at poking holes in things, but they're not the best at actually writing. Some of them are good, but not all of them. So we try to have a very collaborative, team-based approach like that to more efficiently deliver the outcomes that our clients need and really work closely with our clients. We also are a fully remote team, so that decreases our overhead and allows us to hire the best talent from across the US and Europe. And we really try to tailor our services for any startup. Our whole goal of being in business is to be able to get these technologies that are very promising from the laboratories and from the bench side actually into commercialization, because it's a very difficult process. On that note, most of our clients that we work with are first-time founders, so they're physician turned founders or professor turned founders. On that note, they're very new to the medtech space. So in addition to regulatory, we make a lot of other introductions to other service providers who they're going to need to work with on their journey for us to be able to have a successful de novo or PMA submission. All right, next slide. These are some examples of some of the things we refer out for really regularly, because everyone they work with needs to be of high quality, needs to be able to work with startups so that essentially we can all be successful at the end. Next slide. These are some of the types of clients that we work with, all the way from hospitals, all the way up from pre-seed to Series B. Next slide. And our team has a combined experience of over 100 FDA submissions, over 10 EU MDR submissions, and we represent clients across the medical device and in vitro diagnostic spectrum. Although it's great to be presenting here because neurology is our biggest single group. Almost 30% of our practice is represented by neurology clients, with closely followed by cardiology. Next slide. We work with clients globally, so across the US and APAC, Europe and APAC regions, looking to come to the US FDA. All right, next slide. And the other key pillar of our organization is education, because we see that there's a disconnect between researchers in the university setting having a great idea in the lab or at the bench side, they're developing a device and not knowing what to do with it next. So we lecture quite a bit, either seminars, lunch and learns, guest lectures, all day trainings on what are the tips and tricks of going from bench side to actual commercialization, thinking about the FDA, what are the next steps they need to think about, and what does that look like? So these are some of the places we chat at pretty regularly. Next slide. These are some of our partners, sponsors, members that we work with. Next slide. And a lot has been going at the FDA this year, as all of you, I'm sure, are aware, and happy to chat more about that if questions come up afterwards. But CDRH has not been exempted from this, although the drug side is definitely taking a hit as well. Next slide. All right, so before I end, I also just wanted to touch on what does the neurology panel look like lately. And so I would say there's a significant number of breakthrough device designations being granted in this space, specifically for neurology. Let's see. There's quite a few neurotherapeutics, prescription, digital therapeutics for migraine, mood disorders, different types of very specific named conditions. A lot more minimally invasive neuromodulation types, as we've been seeing today. A lot of this you've been seeing today. And then I did put on the bottom of the screen the 5 de novos that have been cleared this year so far in the neurology space. And I'm sure these will be precedent for a lot more coming through the 510(k) pathway going forward. All right, last slide. All right, this is a little unclear, but I did have another slide. But basically, we did a comparison of the neurology branch, OHT5, for the first 2 quarters of this year compared to the first 2 quarters of last year to see what does it look like? Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? And what we saw is on the 510(k) side, we've been seeing a significantly more number of submissions come in and a significantly larger number of decisions received on the 510(k) side, and actually a decrease in review time slightly by about 5 days. So this is surprising. It was about 200 to 275. We saw the same thing on the de novo side, although much smaller numbers in general. It was 9 to 13. And actually on this side, it was significantly shorter, almost 100 days shorter average review time for 2025 versus 2024. On the PMA side, there was no change. And then on the pre-submission side, we actually saw a decrease in pre-submissions from this year compared to last year, and a decrease in the number of asking for written feedback. So what that essentially reflects is that, yes, there's a significant interest in neurology and the neuromodulation field right now, and we're actually seeing it by the number of applications going through the FDA and getting approved. And this is for medium risk now. The medium risk on this area is significantly growing. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Lindsay, tell us about Adroxy.
Yes, I have slides, but I didn't send them to you, so I'm just going to talk through it. How about that? So my name is Lindsay Jardine. I just a little bit of background about myself. I've worked at companies large and small, everything from large data, working with Verily and Google, at Project Baseline, developing the Google Watch. After that, I moved to Cala. So I actually was on the team that brought those original submissions to market. And I think I was leaving right as you were coming on as the CEO. And so that's data, neuro, jumped over to cardio. So I worked at Shockwave Medical for a long time, did their de novo and breakthrough PMA submissions. And they've now been acquired by Johnson & Johnson, over to Farapulse, which is now Boston Scientific, also worked on their early stage peripheral as well as their cardiac catheter ablation. And now starting at back in my neuro origins, I'm at Adroxy. So Adroxy is a minimally invasive detect and stim for epilepsy. So what we are working on is a meaningful change in reduction in both seizure length and seizure number of seizures and seizure length, which we've only gotten through our first in human data so far, but out of 10 patients, we've seen a significant reduction in both of those categories, and moving into our feasibility sometime in the next year or two, as soon as we get our fully implanted device. We have a few de-risking studies coming up in Europe. So we're going to continue to de-risk the therapy, figure out who our target patient population is. But because of the broad spatial coverage of our electrodes, so we have 32 contacts, 4 electrodes, 8 contacts each that sit in the subgaleal space, which makes us minimally invasive. We're able to not only treat individual seizure foci, but multifocal seizures as well as evolving seizure foci. So we can switch between targeted therapies as well as more global network effect for patients with LGS or non-focal epilepsy. So we're really excited to see how this plays out in the longer term studies. But yeah, that's where we're at right now.
Great. No, thank you for the overview. So I'm going to have a few questions. Some of them are specific to each of you. Some are more general. But let's start with the general one in terms of looking at whether it's regulatory or reimbursement under today's environment. And it was interesting, Kristen, in terms of what some of your comments in terms of what you had shown in today's administration. But what changes have you seen under the current administration where what you do on your day-to-day, it's different than under the previous administration, if any?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start. So because our clientele is very novel, very complex, we get the most seasoned FDA reviewers who are reviewing our applications, and we get priority. So I don't want to say publicly, but I'll say publicly. So far, our reviews have been as usual this year as well, compared to last year and the prior year. And I think that's because they're just very committed to getting these very novel and very complex innovations to the US market. So they want to do what they need to do to help that. On the flip side, I will say, I know we thank our reviewers very regularly because we know a lot of their administrative staff, a lot of the people who would normally do a lot of the other activities, they don't have right now. So we've been really grateful to our reviewers. We had one reviewer as we were bringing international clients in for an in-person meeting. There was no staff at the FDA to review their clearances. So our reviewer actually drove in and did that himself so that we could have that meeting. So we're very appreciative for them stepping up and helping us to continue moving forward, even though there's a lot of difficulties in their path.
Great. Lindsay or Renee, feel free to respond, even though you're not in neuro tech right now, but under your current.
I am on the board of NeuroPay still, and so they kind of ran into the buzzsaw with a lot of the new. They're changing different categories for coding, and luckily, as of now, we successfully have navigated that. But it was not pretty there for a while, and as a publicly traded company, not pretty is not good.
Yeah.
And Lindsay, being in-house, what have you seen under the current administration? Any differences?
No, I haven't quite seen, so we're in the TAP program. So we have breakthrough. We got breakthrough in early 24. We're in the TAP program. So we have not seen specific reductions in force or timeline. So with the TAP program, we have a shortened timeline for pre-subs and reviews. So 21 days for things like biocomp, 40 days for any other submission. But that's not to say that we don't still feel the pressure. So having that like constantly looming, I'm always checking in with my TAP coordinator saying like, are you guys okay if I send this submission in? And she's like, let me check to see if we can. So it's not necessarily something that I see specifically that like something was rejected or something was not reviewed on time. It's more of it's when's the dam gonna break? If they keep cutting back, when's the TAP program gonna go? When's this gonna go? So it's more of a constant fear that we will not get things reviewed on time, which I think that's also a fear at the FDA, which that's my opinion.
Some specific questions, then we're going to move to the audience. But Renee, you had reference in terms of being with Cala Health. You had originally received a payment level of tens, which was about $400, and then you were managed to actually appeal and overturn that and get about a $3,800 payment level, which makes it a viable business. And some other companies are still stuck with the tens.
But we actually started with coding. So their first pronouncement to us in like May of 2020, to the heart of COVID, was that we should just use TENS codes for both the stimulator and the band. And so we first did our first appeal process on both of those topics. We got it overturned for coding on the stimulator, but again, they came back and said use TENS coding. So this was a multiple times that getting told that we should just use TENS was not new. We'd heard it time and time again.
Right. But what was that tipping point in terms of convincing the agency that to move from the 400 to the 3,800?
Because we got because our technology works. I mean, that's the bottom line, is the technology works very well, and we have many, many publications to prove that. There was also a study that we found that was done in the 1990s that was studying a TENS device placed on the wrist to try to treat essential tremor, and it failed miserably. So we actually had data that our ability and the way we modulated the signal into the two nerves at the wrist actually did benefit versus over TENS.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't do it head to head, but we had at least a published paper that said TENS does not work in essential tremor.
Okay, great. And one last question, Renee. In terms of looking in today's environment, what would you have done differently today, whether it's on the regulatory or reimbursement perspective? Essentially lessons learned and that you can convey to the folks out there.
There's a huge positive when you look at the data that came out of Stanford that showed on average it takes a company somewhere on the order of 5 to 7 years to go from first submission to CMS to coverage. We got it basically in 4. And so very painful way to learn that lesson was because we had to exit half the company. We had a sort of a big push on the sales organization that I probably would have slowed down now that I have 20/20 hindsight. But in the end, we got it a lot faster than a lot of other people. Yeah.
That's amazing. Kristen, in terms of, you had mentioned your firm does VC due diligence.
Yep.
Is that both on the regulatory and reimbursement side? And, without disclosing obviously the clients, but what are some of the most common questions that they're asking that you're performing?
Yeah, on the regulatory side exclusively to determine if it's going to be, if what they've set up so far is reasonable and what's their likelihood of success. So whether that be for a trial that they're working on, what is our thought on how successful they're going to be? What's their regulatory strategy look like? Is it a good regulatory strategy? Is there something that they're missing? So really it's a double check of what they're already in the process of doing.
You also mentioned your primary focus is for startups. And how many startups are out there? Raise your hand if you have a startup. Whoa, lots of them. Startups are often, particularly if it's very early stage, they just don't have a lot of capital. Do you sometimes work with firms in a creative way that can't afford to pay, whether it's equity, whether it's delayed, whatever it is? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that was our whole point of creation, is to be able to get more of these companies to the next step when they're very early on. So we meet the companies wherever they're at. And our entire focus is to say, you definitely have a limited capital, potentially no capital. So what is the most essential thing we can do right now to support you to get that to that next step, whether that be your first funding, your next funding round, whatever that may be, and make sure you're hyper focused on that so you don't preemptively do too much and potentially burn through capital too fast.
Great. Lindsay, since you are the in-house here, tell a little bit about, and what percentage of your time is on regulatory versus reimbursement, first of all?
So my job title is VP of Clinical Regulatory and Quality. I've now taken on marketing. So I do almost entirely, I do the reimbursement strategy for my company, but regulatory versus clinical and quality and reimbursement kind of depends on the day. So depends on the need. If we're coming up with a reimbursement workshop that we're doing next week, almost 100% of my time has been doing a lot of the background on reimbursement. And then we're working with our consultants, because everybody should use consultants, to make sure that we're getting the right codes and everything, or
All right.
getting the right plan in place.
And to that point, in terms of, when you look at scaling your company, I mean, how big is your company today? How big is your team that supports those efforts? And when do you decide to do something in-house versus outsourcing it to a consultant?
Yeah. So right now, my company is kind of split between two different factions. So we have the original IP, which is in Hungary. So that's about a team of 45 people. And then we have the US base, which is a Droxay company. And that's about 7 people right now. So when we're looking to scale to market, which is the majority of my specialty, is what I do, is I scale from early stage all the way to market. Reimbursement is incredibly important when you're planning for clinical studies. So you have to shape, I think Kristen said this earlier, you have to shape your endpoints in order to meet your reimbursement needs. So you have to make sure that you are capturing what payers want to see, and you're making sure you're publishing, you're forming your endpoints. So when you do get to market, you can shorten that timeline from 5 to 7 years to 4 years when you're making sure you're hitting all the right points.
Great. Before we crack open Jim's 18-year-old bourbon there, questions from the audience? Okay. Jim, why don't you ask the first question?
Okay, but
I think they're all eager to open that bottle up.
No one else. Okay, so here's a question I want to throw at you, Renee, and I want to start with a kind of an anecdote. A few years ago, actually 20 years ago, we had as our keynote speaker at the Neurotech Leaders Forum a guy by the name of Skip Cummins. Anyone remember that name? He was the CEO of a company called Cyberonics, which of course is now LivaNova. Now Skip did he was a little bit of a controversial figure. He did something that people didn't think he was going to be able to do, and that was get FDA approval for vagus nerve stimulation for depression. Unfortunately, could not get reimbursement. His sales force turned on him, made him the whipping boy, he was out. There's other stories like this, but it's kind of interesting. We at Neurotech reports were tracking the telehealth story, the ups and downs. So my first question to you is, how did you deal with all the ups and downs that you had to deal with during those years?
I don't know, Allie, how'd I do? You know, listen, I had never been a CEO. That was the first time CEO. And 9 months after I started, we hit COVID. And the only thing I knew was that I had to ship product to patients. And so that means I needed a group of people in that were my manufacturing techs. I needed my quality people and I needed my shipping people to basically serve our patients. I didn't need my software team. They could stay at home. But if those people were in, I was in. And so for about 9 months, I walked around with a Lysol wipe in each hand and I wiped down every surface I possibly could multiple times a day, keeping my employees safe. And so when you hit these bumps in the road that were, I mean, it was truly existential. It was a Friday before Memorial Day weekend at 5 p.m. Eastern that those at the MAC contractors published their decision saying our technology wasn't medically necessary. I went to my data science team and I said, guys, we can solve this. I know the data will show in the more severe patients, this works and it works well, and they use it for a significant length of time. I have letters from these patients. So I knew in my core that it would work. By Tuesday, I called a board meeting and we had the data. And so that set us on the right path. I did the right thing for the employees, the team. I made a lot of thank yous to my data science team for the weekend work. But it worked well. And so again, being as transparent as you can to your employees, being true to yourself and your patients, those are the little mini CEO lessons I learned in that journey.
Cool. And then my second question, is kind of off topic from reimbursement and regulatory, but I think something that's relevant to all of us here, with so many startups and investors here, is when you have a startup, a young company with a technology heavy founder who may or may not be, there a long term as the CEO. How delicate is that? And you went through it twice, I guess, as coming in as a new CEO and then going out after you fired yourself. That's kind of funny. But how do you deal with that issue? You started as an investor at J&J. How do you deal with that issue of discussing or negotiating with the founder CEO to say, hey, how long are you sticking around, and is it time to bring in a new CEO, things like that. So just any advice that you can offer there as someone who's been through it on both sides.
Yeah, Kate and I were very close because I was the person who got her to start the damn company in the first place. And so of course the board said, well, Renee, you know her best, you go tell her. And at first we were not going to hire someone who was an existing board member. We were looking externally, and we actually made 2 offers to other candidates. And I was personally frustrated because the profile of the job, first and foremost, I said to Kate, no one can take the founder title away from you. And that was something I think that got her through that period and was more accepting of interview. She was part of the interview process for the CEOs that we were talking to. And then finally, when I raised my hand to do it, I think she was relieved. Obviously, there was a little desire for her to continue to do the job of CEO. But once she realized she wasn't doing finance and legal and HR, she was so happy. She's like, get me back to my science. I'm all good. So she ended up being founder and CSO.
Okay.
But it took a while.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
Otherwise, I'll have the last word. So to each of the panel members here, when it comes to reimbursement, because we have a lot of startups there, 30 seconds or less, what recommendations can you make to the startups out there when it comes to reimbursement strategy?
Early and often. Always consider reimbursement when you are planning your regulatory or clinical strategy. It is incredibly important to make sure that you are planning according to what they want to see. Because if you get a product to market, who cares if you can't sell it? You have to make sure you're planning for success in the post-market, because that's when the game really actually starts.
If it's not published, it does not exist to any payer, whether it's CMS or private payers. Get things published. It's really, really important.
Great point.
Yeah, and it's coding coverage and payment. If just because you have a CPT code doesn't mean people are going to pay for your device. doesn't mean they're going to believe in the differentiation of your device. One part. And then the other thing I would say is people tell me that they've asked and done market research to figure out what they want to see, but are you making sure to ask the right people? Are you asking not the physicians who are going to use the device, but actually the people who are really going to pay for the device? So the hospital administrators, the reimbursers, and both on the public and the private side. So really making sure, like Lindsay said, to have those conversations very early and often is critical. And as you get more information, pivot your regulatory strategy.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That wraps up today. And Jim, take us home.